This is Christopher John Björkness. It is January 29th, 2023. I'd like to give everyone a bit of a heads up about the real nature of secessionism and secessionist movements. The Russian communists have been engaging in hybrid warfare against the United States of America for more than 100 years. Before that, the Rothschild family instigated the American Civil War. And all of this is still pertinent today, where we see libertarians, prominent libertarians, and Republicans calling for secession. Many of these people are puppets of the Putin regime. They want to divide us in order to conquer us. Lenin stated more than 100 years ago that one of the fundamental aims of communism is to create secessionist movements. This is done not in order to create small ethno-states, quite the contrary. This is done to break apart historic empires and great nations in order to then make them a fifth column and an instrument of global communism. It's not to create nations, it's instead to create a centralized global government run by the Marxists out of Russia that will eventually take over the world. So they typically dupe well-intentioned people into pursuing their own independent sovereignty in the name of self-determination, only to then subvert it if they are successful and incorporate it into global international Marxist communism as a global government, which will ultimately be run out of Jerusalem. It's very important to know where all this secessionism is coming from in order to know where it's headed and what the ultimate aims of the Russian secessionists are for America and the British Empire and the rest of the world, and what they have been for centuries. This is part of a very ancient plan to destroy the national sovereignty of every nation other than the Israelites and convert the world into a unified global government. Just as there is one God of Israel, there will be one nation on earth. Lenin made very clear the intention of the secessionists. The Marxists have always instigated secessionist movements. They have funded them. They have led them. And again, the goal is not to create and carve up large nations and great empires into small ethno-states other than Israel and Palestine. The goal is instead to break apart the empires and supplant them with the global international communist empire, and to dupe people into doing this themselves. This is a form of force multiplication. It establishes a communist fifth column. It then creates a beachhead for the communists within the great nation or a great empire, from which they can then spread their propaganda, and eventually they hope to take over all the world in this way. Lenin described these plans in the early 20th century, but it had been a part of Marxism and Rothschildism long before then. Lenin wrote, "Socialists cannot achieve their great aim without fighting against all oppression of nations. They must, therefore, unequivocally demand that the social democratic parties of the oppressor countries, especially of the so-called great powers, should recognize and champion the oppressed nation's right to self-determination in the specifically political sense of the term, i.e. the right to political secession. The socialist of a ruling or colonial nation who does not stand for that right is a chauvinist. That is why our struggle against annexations will be meaningless and will not scare the social patriots in the least unless we declare that a socialist of an oppressor nation who does not conduct both peacetime and wartime propaganda in favor of freedom of secession for oppressed nations is no socialist and no internationalist, but a chauvinist. Lenin there makes clear that the goal of secessionism is not nationalism. It is internationalism. They are not seceding into an ethno-national state. They are instead subverting their own country to make it a part of the global international communist government. The socialist of an oppressor nation who fails to conduct such propaganda in defiance of government bans, i.e., in the free, i.e., in the illegal press, is a hypocritical advocate of equal rights for nations. Russia is a prison of peoples, not only because of the military feudal character of Tsarism, and not only because the great Russian bourgeoisie support Tsarism, but also because the Polish, etc., bourgeoisie have sacrificed the freedom of nations and democracy in general for the interests of capitalist expansion. The Russian proletariat cannot march at the head of the people towards a victorious democratic revolution, which is its immediate task, or fight alongside its brothers, the proletarians of Europe, for a socialist revolution without immediately demanding fully and rückhaltlos for all nations oppressed by Tsarism the freedom to secede from Russia. This we demand not independently of our revolutionary struggle for socialism, but because this struggle will remain a hollow phrase if it is not linked up with a revolutionary approach to all questions of democracy, including the national question. We demand freedom of self-determination, i.e. independence, i.e. freedom of secession for the oppressed nations, not because we have dreamt of splitting up the country economically, or of the ideal of small states, but on the contrary, because we want large states and the closer unity and even fusion of nations on a truly democratic, truly internationalist basis, which is inconceivable without the freedom to secede. Just as Marx in 1869 demanded the separation of Ireland, not for a split between Ireland and Britain, but for a subsequent free union between them, not so as to secure justice for Ireland, but in the interests of the revolutionary struggle of the British proletariat. We, in the same way, consider the refusal of Russian socialists to demand freedom of self-determination for nations, in the sense we have indicated above, to be a direct betrayal of democracy, internationalism, and socialism. The Lithuanians, Polish, Latvians, Estonians, Czechs, etc., were all duped into seeking to secede from the Russian Empire, which ultimately led in part to the collapse of the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, at which point all of these states were incorporated into the expanding global government of the Communist International. The goal was not to give Lithuanians and Poles their independence and freedom, but instead to enslave them under communist tyranny. The Red Terror then set about to exterminate the bourgeoisie and destroy any society's ability to run itself as an independent state. In Germany, soon after Lenin spoke these words, the Bavarian Soviet Republic was formed out of Germany, which had been a long-standing goal, which was forwarded by the Kulturkampf to pit the Prussian Northern Germans against the Catholic Bavarians divide Germany, create Marxist states out of both Prussia and Bavaria, and then turn all of Germany back into one unified communist nation that would then be incorporated into the international globalist communist government. There was Kurt Eisner and Eugen Leviné in Bavaria, and there were the Spartacists and the Northern Communists, including Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and his father, and they tried to divide Germany against itself and create two Marxist nations that would then become one Marxist nation and part of global Marxism. Hungarian separatists, Hungarian secessionists, wanted to secede from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the crown of the emperor. That led eventually to the formation of the nation of Hungary, which was then led by the Marxist Bela Kun, who implemented the Red Terror in Hungary and enslaved the Hungarians, all in the name of providing them with self-determination. When that failed, he then moved on to Germany to help the German communists. In England, the Irish labor movement was established to create a separatist and secessionist split in the British Empire, not in order to free Ireland, as Lenin made crystal clear, but instead to enslave Ireland and Britain into the global communist tyranny, which eventually became the Soviet Union and communist China, which has murdered 200 million human beings. They seek to dupe Americans into falling into the same trap. They are promising independence, self-determination, and ethno-sovereignty to Americans. There are traitors in our midst who pretend to be nationalists and patriots, but instead are crypto-communists. They often appear on RT Russian television, which is Russian government state-sponsored. They are often Russian and Putin apologists who want to subvert NATO and balkanize America with secessionist movements in California and Texas primarily, which were instigated and funded and led out of Moscow in order to balkanize the United States, pit us against one another, create a Russian and communist Chinese beachhead in America from which to then expand their communist empire. Lenin also wrote, "Victorious socialism must necessarily establish a full democracy and consequently not only introduce full equality of nations, but also realize the right of the oppressed nations to self-determination, i.e. the right to free political separation. Socialist parties which do not show by all their activity, both now, during the revolution, and after its victory, that they would liberate the enslaved nations and build up relations with them on the basis of a free union. And free union is a false phrase without the right to secede. These parties would be betraying socialism. Only in this way could he counterpose the opportunist and bourgeoisie reformism, which even to this day, half a century later, has not carried out the Irish reform with a revolutionary solution of the given historical task." Again, the Irish labor movement has always been Marxist communist. Sinn Féin is a good example of Irish Bolsheviks. Only in this way could Marx maintain, in contradiction to the apologists of capital who shout that the freedom of small nations to secede is utopian and impracticable, and that not only economic but also political concentration is progressive, that this concentration is progressive when it is non-imperialist, and that nations should not be brought together by force, but by a free union of the proletarians of all countries. They did this to the British Empire not only in Ireland, but also in India. They created a secessionist movement. They then pitted the Indians against each other, Muslims and Hindus, to create another separatist movement, which became Pakistan. All of these were communistic, secessionist movements. Their goal is not to create independent nations, but instead to create a global government. Marx advanced it in the interests of the British proletariat when he demanded freedom for Ireland, although he assumed the probability of a federation following upon secession. In other words, he did not demand the right of secession for the sake of splitting and isolating countries, but to create more durable and democratic ties. Again, it was not to create small independent ethno-states, but instead to supplant capitalistic empires with a global communistic empire. In the 1920s and 30s, the Leninist communists created a secessionist movement among blacks in the southeastern United States. They called for the self-determination and self-sovereignty of black Americans in this proposed Soviet republic. It was also referred to as the Black Belt Autonomous Republic, the Socialist Republic of New Africa. We have a modern equivalent in the Mexican-American Aztlan movement. La Raza, the race, wants to create a Mexican nation out of the southwestern United States. This is a very similar separatist segregationist movement meant to undermine the national sovereignty of the United States of America, to create a beachhead for the Communist Chinese and the Soviet Russians on American soil so that they can create an army within our borders to then pit against all of us. We see libertarians and Republicans calling for California and Texas to secede. These people have close affiliations with Moscow. Many of them appear on RT television. They are Putin apologists. They are Russian apologists. They are anti-NATO. They are anti-interventionists so that the communists have a free hand to destroy independent countries around the globe without America providing them with any means of self-defense. These people are traitors. They are not working to create independent ethno-states and carve up America for that sake. They are instead spreading communism within our borders to pit us against one another so that the communist Chinese can take over Texas, California, and Alaska in collaboration with the Soviet Russians and the communist North Koreans, and eventually take over all of the North American continent, just as they are moving on South America and Central America to conquer them. Brazil is part of BRICS. BRICS is a communist international union set up to destroy what the communists call the Atlanticist of America and England. These secessionist movements of the Irish, the Indians, the Chinese, etc., were all set up to break apart the British Empire so that the communists could then supplant it with the Comintern Empire of the ever-expanding Soviet Union. A good example of people who promote secessionism within the United States is Ron Paul. He disparages Abraham Lincoln, who held the Union together in spite of the Rothschilds' Civil War. He tends to promote secessionism. He is a Putin apologist. He is a Russian apologist, and he appears on RT. I'll run through a couple of headlines quickly to demonstrate the Russian origins of American secessionist movements. I've been exposing this for more than a decade. Wish more people would join me in warning Americans about this and about those who promote secessionism in America. They are intending to hand us over to the communist Chinese and the Soviet Russians. He's the founder of the Californian independence movement. Just don't ask him why he lives in Russia. From the Washington Post. Cal exit. Yes, California movement opens embassy in Moscow. The Cal exit movement was exposed as a Russian-instigated subversion of the sovereignty of the United States of America. Why Russia loves the idea of California seceding. Once again, Moscow is winking at a long-shot breakaway movement in the U.S. Ron Paul and many others keep reawakening this long-shot breakaway movement. This has been long-standing in Puerto Rico. The Catalonians finally succeeded at the behest of the Muscovites, the communists of Russia, who want to balkanize all the nations so that they can then incorporate them into a global Soviet Union. Ron Paul spoke at the von Mises organized events, Breaking Away the Case for Secession. You can view it on YouTube. Secession and Liberty, Ron Paul, who appears on RT frequently, who promotes the gold standard, which destroys the American dollar. He's undermining our most precious institutions. If the American dollar falls, America will fall with it. This was the event. Here's Ron Paul speaking at this event. And what's behind Russian support for world's separatist movements? Britain's vote to leave the European in June is just the beginning if some in the Kremlin have their way. Again, I just wanted to run through a few headlines so that people get a feel for the fact that it's well documented that the secessionist movements are being instigated by Marxists, Leninists, communists. They are not in Americans' best interests. Instead, they are meant to pit us against one another, as happened in the Civil War, so that we destroy each other for the benefit of the communists. The communists will then set about to kill the best of our citizens, if not all of us, should they succeed in balkanizing America and creating a fifth column and a front army for their forces on American soil. I am the author of numerous books which address the globalist agenda and its biblical origins. You can find my books at my website, CJBBooks.com. There are also donation links. There will be a link to my website and my donation page in the description below. Please help to keep me going and sponsor my work by donating. And please take a look at my books. You may find some of them extremely interesting and quite valuable. Thank you very much.